They also continue in their same work to quote Carnes, who describes an addiction cycle. As you can see on your screen, Carnes described the progression of untreated sexual addiction. The first phase, the initiation phase, is characterized by an exceptionally intense impact of observed or experienced sexual activities during the development of as an adolescent or young adult. At some point, sex becomes the drug of choice, used to escape or to cope. Catalytic environments and catalytic experiences lead to an establishment phase, in which there is a repetition of an addictive cycle of preoccupation. With time, the addiction may escalate with greater intensity, more frequency, more risk, and greater loss of control. Intermittently, the behaviors may de-escalate at times through the means of substituting other addictive behaviors, such as a period of heavy drug use, or it may progress to the acute phase, where the individual becomes alienated from significant others and is constantly preoccupied with the addiction cycle. In some, the addiction becomes immutable and the behavior is limited only by opportunity, physical consequences, or incarceration. So let's just kind of walk through those four stages. The initiation phase is usually Pat talks about. This is when we were kids getting into pornography, just starting to experiment, moving into that. The establishment phase is oftentimes when the addict, male or female, begins to set up rituals. We haven't talked about cross-dressing. Let's talk about that for a moment. I know this bodybuilder, African-American gentleman who was a sex addict, but he was a cross-dresser. Now, during his initiation phase, he introduced his sister's clothing, his mother's clothing, and he would wear them during his sexual engagements with himself. And he began an establishment phase where he began to wear their clothes, their dresses, their bras, their underwear, and the whole thing began to establish a pattern of ritualized sexual activity that he was positively reinforcing neurochemically with these behaviors, with the clothing. Then it escalated, okay? And he got into, as an adult, he would actually go shopping for his own clothes and wear women's clothes. He had a little closet full of stuff. Now, honestly, he didn't have no hair, and he was a African-American bodybuilder, and probably very little fat. I mean, he couldn't look good in any of these things from an objective standpoint. But he had this kind of fantasy stuff that he established, and what happened is that moved into where he escalated, okay, and he would actually go through a phase right before treatment where he was actually considering, further steps in his addiction process, hanging out with other people who cross-dressed and exposing himself to other people in a known manner. And this was creating distress for him. That's what caused him to get into treatment. But we can see through this story and other stories. I mean, I can look at this initiation phase, establishment phase, the escalation phase. Now, the de-escalate phase doesn't always happen to everyone. Some people de-escalate because they get married and it kind of subsides for a little while and then they go back to it. Some people never de-escalate. That's not something I've seen all the time. So that de-escalate phase might be an exception in that phase. Now, the acute phase is also not a phase in which everyone gets to. Some people do not become incarcerated. Some people do not get so crazed by their sex addiction that they're not doing some responsible things in their life. Now, having said that, there are people who get into this acute phase. They're the guys who are going to the bookstores and hanging out for hours and hours a day. They're the guys who, with their last $10, they're trying to get some prostitute to service them. There are guys and ladies who have so debilitated their life that sex addiction has become the primary way they do life, and that is the acute phase. Now, for you as a clinician, if you're looking at someone who's 20, 40, or 60, you might see the different stages here, because some of these stages take decades to get to. Very rarely does someone go from 14 to going to prison. Happens, but that's not the norm. Normally, in my experiences, the initiation phase is your adolescence, young adulthood phase. That also includes your establishment phase, the adolescence, young adulthood, where the particular types of behavior you're probably going to be involved in your sex addiction for most of your life are really strongly getting rooted. Now, some people will have an escalation stage where they get into more stuff. This can move into the late 20s or early 30s or 40s, depending on how they're progressing in their addiction. Also, one of the factors that this particular model does not incorporate is the moral structure of the individual. Someone who has a very strong moral or religious upbringing might move at a slower pace because the lines are harder for them to cross. Someone with a more secular worldview may not have those boundaries to have to deal with, or those messages to have to deal with, and so they'll blast through a whole bunch of decisions without a moral compass, and that would make this a lot easier for them to get acute very quickly. So in the de-escalating phase, again, I don't see that happening as often, and I don't see the acute phase happening as often, but I definitely see the insight that Pat is mentioning here, Pat Carnes, on initiation and establishment. And one of the things that Carnes is noted for throughout the material is the ritualization, and I think that's part of the cycle that he's talking about here in the establishment phase, is there's a ritualization that happens. And as a clinician, let's walk through that just a moment. Finding out the ritualized behavior of the person you're treating is going to be very important for you to break the cycle. Because if you know that the ritual includes, let me give you I was working with a missionary, and this guy had a very ritualized structure. He was a single man, he didn't have any relationships, his social agility was very limited, and he had a pattern, okay? His pattern was, now, he's a missionary, so he had to kind of work through some of that moral code thing that we were talking about. So to do that, what he did is he first stopped off at 7-Eleven and or some other convenience store, and he would pick up a 6-pack of beer. And he would drink that and maybe get 2. Drink 1 or 2 6-packs, okay? This would usually start around 6 or 7 o'clock at night. Then he would go to a regular bar, and there he'd order a few drinks of whiskey or get pretty much where he's starting to get kind of tipsy. Then he would drive himself down to the road to a strip club, and he would watch the girls for an hour or two, and then he would set up a prostitute appointment right after that. But see, he had a ritual because he had to kind of wear down his own moral resistance, so he had to get drunk enough so he could act out. And so for me as his clinician, I was walking through this and walked through his ritualization and said, now listen, we got to stop the 7-Eleven. If we stop the 7-Eleven, we'll probably stop the strip club, stop the prostitute. Okay, because if we can get you not to drink beer for a while, then you won't numb out, and what will happen is you will be morally awake. And he's never had sex with a prostitute morally awake, because he couldn't get there from his missionary perspective to a prostitute. He couldn't get there awake. He had to numb himself down. His ritualization involved numbing himself down so he could go act out. And then he would do this periodically, and he had the same exact cycle. Most addicts have a ritualization, and one of the things this cycle can help you with is to define that for them. And I've had several addicts write out, what is your modus operandi? How is it that you act out? Take me from not acting out to acting out. How does this work? If it involves other people, what are your lines? What are your pickup lines? Where are you going? How are you dressing? What are you doing? For the female addict, it almost invariably involves clothes. There's an outfit they'll wear. Okay, we need to get rid of that outfit or get rid of that style of clothes so that you don't use that as your ritual. Whatever we need to do to kind of break or interrupt the cycle can be very, very instrumental for you as a clinician to help them become successful. There's nothing better as a sex addict than knowing that you've beat this thing one day. There's no better feeling than knowing that, hey, I didn't act out today. You have the opportunity as their clinician to help them have some really good days of beating something that has beat them up for a very, very, very long time. All right, now we're going to continue with another cycle, and this one is a little bit longer, and so you're going to have to kind of watch again on your screen as we go through this. And this one comes from Goodman, and I really enjoy Goodman's work. He does tend to write a lot, and so sometimes when we're recording him, it's going to take us quite a few moments to get through his work, but it's so worth taking that trip because he tends to give you some good nuggets along the way that can be productive for you in the work you're planning to do here as someone who works with sexual addiction. All right, Goodman states this. In the course of my work with individuals who suffer from psychoactive substance abuse disorders, bulimia, pathological gambling, or sexual addiction, I noticed that these conditions share a number of characteristic clinical features. They include, and we're going to go through, I believe it is Oh, it looks like over 10 of these, or at least 10. Number 1, the course of illness. The disorder typically begins in adolescence or early adulthood and follows a chronic course with remissions and exacerbations. Now, this is an important thing because the course of the illness, the course of sex addiction, does have ebbs and flows. It's not this, rocket ship that goes straight up all the time. Most cases, it's not. It's usually kind of plods along, and then there's this plateau, and then plods a little higher, might go down, might be even abstinent for a while, then plods back up, then it goes up higher, plateaus there, kind of settles there for a while, and then maybe goes higher. So this ebb and flow thing you need to know, because usually what's happening with my clients is if they haven't just gotten caught. If they got caught, that's why they're in my office. But if they haven't just gotten caught, what's happened is their addiction's kind of been here for a while, and they're starting to feel it move up, or it actually has moved up. And they've made that phone call, or they've done this thing with another person, and it's moved up, and that's usually when they'll start intersecting and trying to say, I need to get some help because I'm out of control. All right, number 1 was a course of illness. Number 2, behavioral features. Narrowing of behavioral repertoire, continuation of the behavior despite harmful consequences. And again, number 2, this kind of highlights this whole thing of there's a repertoire, there's a certain narrow focus that the sex addiction can take on. Now some guys, anything goes all the time kind of thing, but many of them it's a very, very narrow focus. They want, and it gets over time even more narrow as they go down that process. Number 3, individual subjective experience of the condition. This is a sense of craving, preoccupation, excitement, duration during preparatory activity, mood altering affects of the behavior, sense of loss of control. Number 4, progressive development of the condition. Craving, loss of control, narrowing of behavior repertoire, harmfulness of consequences, tending to increase as the duration of condition continues, increases. Number 5, experience of tolerance. As the behavior is repeated, its potentially to produce reinforcement effects tends to diminish. Number 6, experience of withdrawal, psychological or physical discomfort when the behavior is discontinued. 7, tendency to relapse, return to harmful patterns of behavior after a period of abstinence. Number 8, propensity for behavioral substitution. When the behavioral symptoms of the disorder have come under control, tendency for addictive engagement in other behaviors to emerge or intensify. Now, let's just talk about 8 for a moment. I spent a lot of time early in getting my master's degree in AA meetings, and it was always funny to me sitting in AA where you have some person, male or female, and they're sitting there and they're saying, I've got 15 years of sobriety, and they're drinking a double caffeinated coffee and smoking their cigarette, and you see these replacement addictions, okay? And what he's saying here in number 8 is that you might find some other replacement addictions, and that may even be why, for whatever reason, his sex addiction might have plateaued for a while or even leveled down for a little while, because the other one has gone up. They're drinking more, they're chewing more, they're doing more risk behaviors in a compulsive way, and so that one may be taking its place.